So welcome back for round two. We will pick up in 1861 in Russia and in St. Petersburg. This is the year that Tsar Alexander II decided to abolish serfdom in Russia. And like here in America 4 years later under Abraham Lincoln abolishing slavery, it gave rise to this period of political and social turmoil. And in St. Petersburg, there was this great sense of this radical socialism that began to invade and anti-czarist elements. And there was a nihilist element that took over at that time. And it affected the art world as well. In 1863, in St. Petersburg, there was an academy there. And that was the year that many of the members of the Art Academy decided to rebel against their graduation assignments, which were apparently to paint mythological landscapes and gods and goddesses. And they said, well, this is just, beside the point, considering what's going on at this point. So they broke away and they formed their own radical art movement. And it was their mission to represent life in all of its grim reality. And these paintings you've been looking at, the last two, were by a major proponent of artistic realism in Russia at that time, whose name was Ilya Repin. He was a great artist, and he was a friend of many of the composers and writers and art critics of the day. He painted all of their portraits, including this very striking one of this formidable critic whose name is Vladimir Stasov. And he is the one who is credited with codifying the whole philosophical and theoretical basis of what was to become the Mighty Five. He believed that artists, writers, composers in Russia should forego Western European models of academic training. He thought that if they just kept studying Western European styles of music and studying in Western European conservatories, that the best that they could hope to be was watered down Western European composers. And so he was very influential on the central member of the Mighty Five, who was Mily Balakarev. And he was a very domineering person. He was the central sun around whom the others were orbiting, and he was powerful in his influence, and he managed to persuade them in varying degrees to forego Western styles of composition and to dig deep down into their Russian souls to come up with something that would be unique and could vie on its own terms with what was going on in Western Europe. Now, in the 1860s, at exactly that same time, there was, on the opposite side of the fence, a school of composition which was being propagated by this gentleman, Anton Rubinstein. He was a great pianist and a very prolific composer. Such a great pianist that Rachmaninoff in the early 20th century looked back and said, that's one of the greatest pianists I ever heard in my life. And he was probably the only Russian-born musician in the 19th century up till that point who could actually make a living doing what he had been brought up to do. And he ranged around Europe and even America playing piano solos. And when he was a child prodigy in the 1830s, he visited Paris and he played for the likes of Chopin and Liszt, and everybody was very impressed. And he spent some time in Berlin, and he studied with a great German pedagogue whose name was Siegfried Dehn, with whom Glinka had actually studied as well. And that transformed him into a European-style composer. And so his music is consciously modeled after the music of Mendelssohn and particularly Schumann, very much not Mussorgsky and Balakarev. He didn't like what they were doing. They didn't like what he was doing. He was a very powerful personality. And it was his mission to form a conservatory there in downtown St. Petersburg that would bring Western-style musical education to the heart of St. Petersburg. And he allied himself with a beautiful and intelligent and cultured duchess whose name was Elena Pavlovna. She actually was from Stuttgart, but she, like him, believed that St. Petersburg needed to have Western cultural centers, and they were a natural match. And so they spent a lot of time together out at her beautiful palace on Kameny Island. And he wrote a lot of music which was either dedicated to her or inspired by her and her staff and by this beautiful environment, including this one. I'll play you a little bit of it. Its nickname is Angelic Dream, and it is this curvaceous and rather shimmering piece in a song without words style. As you hear, it is very Mendelssohnian or maybe Schumannesque and not at all Mussorgskian or Balakirevian. And in 1862, he opened up this conservatory with the backing of Duchess Pavlovna, the St. Petersburg Conservatory. And this flew directly in the face of what Stasov and the Mighty Five and Balakirev were trying to accomplish there and made them furious. And they tried to found their own rival conservatory, which they called the Free School of Music, and it just collapsed under its own weight. It simply could not withstand this very well-organized and very well-funded competition from Rubinstein and his mentor, Duchess Pavlovna. And over the course of the late 19th century, the early 20th century, it spewed out these astonishing performers and these astonishing composers, and it had a profound impact on the musical life there in Russia and in St. Petersburg and also Western Europe, and really as far as America. Much of conservatory training here is influenced directly by what happened in the early years of the St. Petersburg Conservatory. And among the first members of the student body there was a very shy and unassuming member of the Ministry of Justice, a young lawyer whose name was Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky. And he, like Glinka and like all of the Mighty Five, had grown up in the landed gentry. He was a member of the upper classes. And so he was shunted away from a life in music. It was considered to be fine if you wanted to become a cultured person and learn to play the piano and maybe compose a little bit on the side. But it was considered to be beneath your status if you were an upper class person. And so he went to the Ministry of Justice and he got a job and he was smart and he was progressing as a counselor. And in 1862 he said, I can't stand this. And he entered into the St. Petersburg Conservatory. And rather quickly it transformed him into this thorough Western European style composer. Although he had grown up there in St. Petersburg, which as you recall, the ethos of St. Petersburg is East-West synthesis. And his music became very popular among the more conservative politicians of the day, like Tsar Alexander III, who took over after the assassination of Alexander II in the 1880s, and also literary figures like Ivan Turgenev, who did not like the Mighty Five at all, and liked Tchaikovsky and what he was doing, and he spoke rather colorfully about that. He said, of all of the young Russian musicians, there are only two with positive talent, Tchaikovsky and Rimsky-Korsakov. The rest should be put in a sack and thrown in the water. When he graduated from the conservatory, you had to write a graduation piece. I think he wrote a cantata. And the members of the Mighty Five, this rival gang, decided to come and hear it. And the one who was maybe the least talented of the composers but had the biggest mouth was César Cui. And he was a writer there for the St. Petersburg Press, and he went and he reviewed it. He said, the conservatory composer, Mr. Tchaikovsky, is totally without merit, which hurt his feelings quite a lot. And he wandered around St. Petersburg for a few days thinking, I am totally without merit. I've done the wrong thing with my life. And then he decided to write a concert overture and dedicate it to Mily Balakirev, who again was the ringleader of the Mighty Five. And he was a very powerful, dominating character, and everybody wanted to appealed to him. He wrote this overture called Fatim. And by that time, I believe he had accepted the position to teach at the Moscow Conservatory, which had been opened by Anton Rubinstein's brother, Nikolai. And so Balakirov learned the piece, and he conducted the premiere of it, and then he wrote to Tchaikovsky to tell him how it had gone. He said, "There wasn't much applause, probably because of the appalling cacophony at the end of the piece, which I don't like at all. It is not properly gestated. It seems to have been written in a very slapdash manner, and the seams show, and as does all of your clumsy stitching." So he took it on the chin again, and he came back for more, and Balakirov suggested, why don't you write an overture based on Romeo and Juliet, the story. And so he destroyed Fatim, and he wrote it, and he apparently gave it to Balakirov from time to time to look at it. And by that time, Balakirov decided that he liked the piece, but I think Tchaikovsky had decided, the hell with this. I'm not on their wavelength. I don't want to become a mighty sixth after all. And so, the irony, of course, is that, Balakirov, we'll hear a piece by him coming up, but for the most part, his music has faded into the mists of time, while Tchaikovsky's music has become the very emblem of late 19th century Russian music. And George Balanchine, again, he went to the St. Petersburg Conservatory. He was a pianist. And he called Tchaikovsky the Petersburg composer. I think because of this essential cosmopolitan East-West quality, and also because, the joke about Tchaikovsky is we always think he only wrote 3 symphonies, the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th. But of course, he wrote a 1st, 2nd, and 3rd as well. And those pieces are very opulent, czarist, triumphant apotheosis. They're really imperial pieces. And I'll play you a little of movement you probably haven't heard, which is the 4th movement of his 3rd symphony, which is a grand polonaise, composed at a time when Poland was under the command of the Russian Empire. And to write a polonaise in a symphony was code for the Romanov dynasty. And this piece, I think you'll hear it, has this sense of Russian imperial grandeur. When we think of Tchaikovsky's late symphonies, I think we always think of them as being about his internal ruminations on his fate and his destiny and his internal tragedies, like the Pathétique, which he wrote and premiered himself conducting in St. Petersburg only 9 days before he died in 1893. And of course, I think it probably is his ruminations about his internal personal tragedies, but there are those who think that this piece and others like it contain an element of premonition of the tragedies that would befall St. Petersburg and the collapse of the imperial dynasty and the, in the revolutions of the 20th century and the almost collapse of St. Petersburg itself, which is not to say that he was clairvoyant or he couldn't see into the future, but as a sensitive artist, in some sense, he must have felt the winds of doom blowing in towards him from the future. Now, all of these composers, Tchaikovsky, the Mighty Five, they were finding ways to incorporate Russian sensibilities into late 19th century music. And in France, French composers wanted to find ways to make French music more French. And there was this disastrous short war that gave it a boost, the Franco-Prussian War, where it was over almost before it started. It started in 1870. By 1871, it was done. And the Prussians laid siege to the city, and they shut off the food supplies, and people began to starve, and the army retreated, and the government collapsed. And it was a terrible, humiliating time in France, but it gave rise to this sense of anger. They wanted to get away from this loathing, generalized loathing of German culture and artistic hegemony. And so the young composer Camille Saint-Saëns in 1871 conspired with a friend of his who was a singer named Romain Boussine, and they decided to start their own organization, which they called the Société Nationale de Musique. And their mission here was to create French music by French composers for French listeners, and all of these wonderful composers became a part of the Société in the 1790s. And it was very effective at producing a lot of orchestral music and a lot of French operas. Saint-Saëns himself, we know Samson and Delilah. He wrote 13 operas. I mean, I've heard a few of them other than Samson and Delilah, and they're very good. And as time went on, he was essentially a French classicist. He didn't really like foreign incursion, although he knew all about it. And in the 1880s, there was this strong influence of Wagnerism, which began to become a part of it. And so he, in protest, resigned from his own organization in the middle 1880s, which was taken over for a while by César Franck and then by Vincent d'Indy, who were more well-disposed towards Wagner. And as he got older and entered into the 20th century, he became more and more reactionary and a bit of a curmudgeon. And he was systematically rejecting all of the evolving currents in French music. He didn't like Debussy's Impressionism, which he found to be too amorphous and shapeless. When he felt this current of Schoenbergian dodecaphonic music coming in, he said, this is too abstract, it's too artificial. In the early years of the 20th century, when Stravinsky became a factor, he went to see The Rite of Spring, pronounced the music to be insane. He lived into his middle 80s. He lived into the 1920s, becoming more and more out of fashion. He lived to hear Darius Milhaud's polytonal experiments, and by that time he'd had it, and he said, fortunately, there are still lunatic asylums in France. But he did have a rather strong impact on contemporary music in France in the early 20th century, because he was a very great teacher. And his greatest students, like Fauré and Ravel, just continued to admire him and be devoted to him. And so in a way, his influence lived on. This period from the 1870s until about the beginning of World War I, we think of it as La Belle Époque, the beautiful era. It's this time of technological advancement and the French Empire on the rise, and this ferment in the artistic world going from Impressionism to Art Nouveau to Cubism. And also, it's this time when France was very proud of its accomplishments, and they had a succession of international expositions, maybe most famously this one in 1889, famous for the Eiffel Tower. And as you see, there were pavilions to celebrate the colonies, and there were African villages, and there was even an Indonesian pavilion in which they had a Javanese gamelan orchestra. And Debussy was fascinated by this. He went to hear it, and it just knocked him for a loop. And he wrote to a friend of his who had also gone to hear it, and he said to his friend, "Do you not remember how the Javanese music was able to express every nuance of meaning, even unmentionable shades, and which make our tonic and dominant seem like empty phantoms for the use of unwise infants?" And I'll play you an example of the kind of music that he heard there. And he emulated this in pieces like his 1903 piano pieces, A Stomp. The first of these movements is called Pagodas, and it really imitates the style of the pentatonic scales and the sounds of the gongs. But it wasn't simple exoticism to him. This language, it sank in at a very deep level. And his major influence, according to what he wrote, was really nature itself. And he wrote eloquently about the effect that nature had on him. He said, "I do not practice religion in accordance with the sacred rites. I have made mysterious nature my religion. When I gaze at a sunset sky and spend hours contemplating its marvelous, ever-changing beauty, an extraordinary emotion overwhelms me, and my hands unconsciously assume an attitude of adoration, and that is what I call prayer." And he evokes this aura of antique pagan religiosity in pieces like his 1904 Sacred and Profane Dances. Mesmerizing music, very sensuous and very French. And, he was an ardent French nationalist in the early 20th century. And at that same time, with the British Empire at its apogee, the early 20th century in London, it was a time of ardent English nationalism. And for the first time since the time of Purcell, we have the emergence of this generation of British composers who were at the center of the musical life. And of these composers, I would say the two that were on the furthest ends of the spectrum from each other were Elgar and Vaughan Williams. This was a time when they were trying to get away from, again, German artistic hegemony in England as well. And Elgar really embraced German styles and continental styles of composition. He liked Brahms and Strauss and Dvorak, and he liked the music of Wagner, which put him out of step with the current of what was going on there. And he was, perhaps for that reason, not very successful until he was almost 40 years old. And he was out of step for other reasons as well. He was Catholic in Protestant England. He came from relatively lower class in class-conscious Victorian and Edwardian England. And he married a lady who was 8 years older than he from the upper classes, Caroline Alice Elgar. And her parents were so upset with her that they disinherited her. And she didn't care. She loved him and she was devoted to him. And when he became discouraged as he was heading into his 40s at having had no tangible success, she said, "Don't worry, your day will come soon." And she was right about that, because not long after that, he wrote the Enigma Variations, and that catapulted him to fame all around the world, and particularly in Germany, where Richard Strauss thought it was just a wonderful piece. And it does have German language, but there's something essentially English in the spirit of it. And Each of the movements are dedicated, as he put it, to my friends within. And they are portraits of people that were very important to him, and pride of place went to his wife, Carolyn Alice Elgar, in the first of these variations, which is rather Brahmsian in its language and has this romantic, sentimental quality to it, this portrait of her. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, as I said, was Ralph Vaughan Williams, who liked Elizabethan music. We know his fantasy and a theme of Thomas Tallis. He liked folk music from England, and like Bartók at that same time, he ranged around in the British English countryside with his Edison recording machine, having people bellow their songs into them so that he could analyze them and find out what made them so essentially English. He did not like German music. He wanted to get as far away from that as he could. And so to rinse himself of that influence, he decided in 1907 to go to Paris for several months and to study with Ravel, which must have taken a certain amount of courage because he was 35 at that time. Ravel was, I think, 3 years younger than he was. But he decided to go. And I think that he expresses a bit of his own ambivalence about that in a description that he gave of his first lesson. He said, "When I had shown Ravel some of my work, he said that for my first lessons, I had better write a little minuet in the style of Mozart. I saw at once that it was time to act promptly. So I said in my best French, 'Look here, I've given up my time, my work, my friends, and my career to come here and learn from you, and I am not going to write a little minuet in the style of Mozart.'" But he did. And apparently he learned a lot from Ravel, and we can hear that in the quality of his music. There is this transparency and this quality in the orchestration and a rather impressionist quality. And one of his first pieces that he composed when he got back to England was his setting of poetry by A.E. Housman from A Shropshire Lad called On Wenlock Edge, scored for tenor, piano, and string quartet. And the first of the movements on Wenlock Edge is this very vivid tone painting of the sound of the wind just blowing over this rocky limestone escarpment there in Shropshire.
On Wenlock Edge, the woods in trouble, this forest feast the reeking heaps, the gale it plies the saplings double, and thick on Severn snow the leaves.
And so in London and Paris and St. Petersburg, this period of rapid technological advancement and artistic and musical advancement, it continued at an increasingly frenetic pace until reaching this climax in the early summer of 1914, which the composer Arnold Bax called that sinister carnival time. And then it all blew up in everybody's face at the beginning of World War I in July of 1914. And suddenly London found itself under attack from these fleets of Zeppelin airships that came over the continent and dropped bombs on London, which must have seemed like something out of a science fiction nightmare.
For 2 long years, these gas-filled monsters poured down death with impunity, while the British struggled to find a way to stop them. Newspaper headlines reflected the anger felt by the British public that Germany could indiscriminately target women and children.
And of the very angry was Ralph Vaughan Williams, who wanted to join the military in the infantry. He was 42 at the time. They said, sorry. So he joined the ambulance corps. And in that capacity, he ranged all across northern France for the 5 years of the war, writing no music at that time, picking up the dead and the dying and the wounded and loading them into his ambulance wagon. And subject to the bombs and the concussion which damaged his hearing, and he went quite deaf towards the end of his life in the 1950s. And when he came back, he started writing music again. And one of the pieces that he wrote was his Third Symphony, which is subtitled the Pastoral Symphony, not because it's about lambs grazing in the bucolic countryside. He wrote to his wife, Ursula, years later, and he described it this way: "It's really wartime music. A great deal of it incubated when I used to go up night after night with the ambulance wagon at Équerre. And we went up a steep hill, and there was a wonderful Corot-like landscape in the sunset." And there is this very poignant moment in the third movement of the piece, which I think is eloquently described by the British composer and conductor Sir Roger Norrington.
Slow and incredibly beautiful movement with a trumpeter improvising his own funeral song, and somehow you know the trumpeter will be dead within a week.
And in Paris, the musicians and composers wanted to get into the war as well. Ravel volunteered for the infantry. He was rejected. He was 39. He weighed 100 pounds. They said, no thanks. He thought maybe he could turn his light frame into an advantage, and he volunteered for the Air Corps. They turned him down. And so, like his friend and erstwhile student, Vaughan Williams, he learned to drive a truck, and he became a military supply deliverer in Verdun during the costliest battle of the war. And he ranged around, and with the bombs falling all around him. And he was a very sensitive man, and he wrote back from the front and said, "For a whole week I have been driving days and nights without lights on unbelievable roads, often with a load double what my truck should carry. And even so, I had to hurry because all of this was within range of the guns." And it had a real impact on his constitution, and he contracted dysentery, and he had to be evacuated back to Paris, and he went into the hospital. And finally, when he got out, he started writing his piano piece called Le Tombeau de Couperin, which on the surface is his paean to French Baroque music from the time of Louis XIV. But it really is about the war, because each of its movements are dedicated to a friend of his who died in the war, or friends who died in the war. For instance, the third movement is called Forlane, and it is this movement dedicated to a Basque painter he knew, whose name was Gabriel Duluc, and he died doing a reconnaissance mission in 1916. And it's a beautiful movement. It has this very wistful quality to it. Exactly the time that he was writing this piece, 16 to 17, the avant-garde there was alive and well with the ever iconoclastic Erik Satie, who was writing a ballet for Sergei Diaghilev in the Ballet Russe called Parade. And his scenario was by Jean Cocteau, and his scenery and the costumes in Cubist style were by Pablo Picasso. And the scenario is about this carnival troupe. It features a Chinese acrobat and this very exuberantly naughty American girl in a sailor outfit. and they are trying to entice people into the carnival. And these elaborate cubist cardboard costumes that Picasso had designed were almost impossible to dance in. It's a pastiche. You hear all these different influences. You hear ambient sounds of the day like typewriters clicking and sirens wailing and gunshots being fired. And it also has a lot of popular musical styles like the ones that he heard played in the cabarets of Montmartre, and it caused a scandal and made him kind of famous for writing this piece. But he was trying to get away from German styles and French Impressionism and to forge a kind of a deadpan clarity that would be very French, and it was very influential. And up in St. Petersburg, they changed the name during the war to Petrograd because St. Petersburg sounded too German. And this was the time in the war, particularly after the war, when all of those forces that were unleashed back in the 1860s with radical socialism and anti-czarist sentiments and anti-imperial sentiments all came to a head in October of 1917 when the Bolsheviks took over the Winter Palace and installed Vladimir Lenin as the head of the provisional government. And as we know, the next 74 years, St. Petersburg was under communist rule. And anybody from the aristocracy, anybody from the czarist world, anybody from the landed gentry, they felt we're in trouble, we better get out of here. And those people fled if they could, and those who were already outside, like Diaghilev and Stravinsky, just stayed outside. Stravinsky sat out World War I in Switzerland. Afterwards, he moved to France, became a French citizen. When World War II broke out, he moved to America, became an American citizen, ended up living incongruously in Hollywood. And he finally went back in 1962 under Khrushchev's regime to St. Petersburg. By that time, it was called Leningrad. And Rachmaninoff came from the landed gentry, and he saw the writing on the wall early. And so in December of 1917, he and his family got into a sleigh, and they headed off across the frontier into Finland, and they never went back. And he also ended up living in Hollywood. Prokofiev left under different circumstances. In 1918, he applied for an official passport. He was granted one. He got in a train. He went east of Vladivostok. He came by ship to Japan and then by ship to America. And he lived for 18 years outside of the Soviet Union, didn't go back until 1936. One composer who did not leave was Dmitri Shostakovich, because he was 11 years old at the time of the revolution. And he entered the conservatory, Petrograd Conservatory at that time, at the age of 13. Alexander Glazunov invited him to come. And so he had a front row seat for all of the wild stuff that was going on, and the battles between the Reds and the Whites, and the starvation in the streets, and the rise of Stalin in the 20s, and the terrors of the 30s, and the Great Patriotic War of the 40s. And he was very influenced also early on by the wild artistic environment of the 1920s, which was under the aegis of this gentleman, Anatoly Lunacharsky, who was a Marxist philosopher who had been installed as the Commissar of Enlightenment by Lenin. He had spent time living in France, and I think he had been educated in Zurich, and he had very adventurous tastes. And he felt that this revolutionary society needed revolutionary art, and so it was under his aegis that you have the rise of the futurists and the constructivists and the suprematists and revolutionary avant-garde poets and theater directors, and also revolutionary music. This gentleman, Arseny Avramov, was, I believe, one of the commissars of music at that time. And in 1922, in honor of the 5th anniversary of the Soviet Union, he was asked to write a piece to celebrate that event. And he wrote a piece not for conventional orchestral forces. He wrote it to be played by the Russian Navy. And it was performed first at the Caspian seaport town of Baku. He called it the Symphony of Sirens. And it is scored for foghorns and ship horns and artillery blasts and a big brass band. It's a wild piece. It goes on for 45 or 50 minutes. And for your listening pleasure, I have distilled it down to its 1-minute essence. You don't hear playing like that anymore. And back in Paris in the 1920s, in the wake of World War I, were a wild time as well. Les années folles, the crazy years, time of Dada and Surrealism. And this was the time of great cross-pollination with American culture, the time of Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald in the 20s. And also, many incipient great American composers came to study with Nadia Boulanger there at that time. When I was at Juilliard in the 1970s, she was still alive, she was still teaching. I had friends who were still going to study with her. She was enormously influential on 20th century music making here in America. And it was the time of great American jazz musicians and popular entertainers who found that they were more appreciated in post-war Paris than they were in the United States, and they went there. And they were particularly appreciated by French composers such as Maurice Ravel, who wrote a lot of pieces that were very directly influenced by the jazz and blues musicians that he heard in the cabarets of Paris, for instance, in his second violin sonata. It was the time of these composers who became known as Les Six, and they were following in the wake of Satie and Parade, and they were trying to get away from German expressionism and French impressionism, and again forge something new. And they were, of course, very much influenced by the cabaret music. You'll hear that in the Sextour by Poulenc in a few days. And all of this was also happening in London. The influence of American popular music was very strong. William Walton, in 1923, wrote a piece in which he set the wild, crazy, incomprehensible poetry of Edith Sitwell. He called it Facade, and he set them for narrator and a small instrumental ensemble, as in L'Histoire du Soldat or Pierrot Lunaire. And in a sense, it was a send-up of those pieces, but it's also sprinkled with this liberal dose of flapper frivolity.
silly and shady, longing to be a lazy lady, walked by the cupolas in the lakes, George and stables. In a fairy tale like the heat intense and the wind and the cruising across the fence, the children gathering strawberries are changed by the heat into negresses.
Though their fair hair shines there like gold-haired planets, Calliope, Io, Pomona, Antiope, Echo, and Clio.
Then Lily O'Brady, silly and shady, sauntered along like a lazy...
I think of it as Downton Abbey rap. And this was the time of burgeoning technology there, and electronic recording became very important there in England and in London in the 1920s and the 1930s. And in 1931, they opened up this brand spanking new EMI studio. It's now called Abbey Road in the wake of the Beatles, because it's at 3 Abbey Road. And as a way of inaugurating this new studio, they invited Sir Edward Elgar and the London Symphony Orchestra to record, for the first thing, Pomp and Circumstance.
Morning, gentlemen. Glad to see you all. Very nice program this morning. Please play this tune as though you've never heard it before.
You all ready? Right.
That's 1931. 1932, in Moscow, Gorky and Stalin got together to try to hammer out what art and music and literature was going to mean in the Soviet Union. And when they were done, they made this announcement. They said, if the artist is going to depict our life correctly, he cannot fail to observe and point out what is leading it towards socialism. So this will be socialist art. It will be socialist realism. And in 1936, 4 years later, Dmitri Shostakovich ran seriously afoul of the dictates of socialist realism when he had his opera Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, which is a very salacious opera, performed, and Stalin came to see it with his cronies and hated it quite a lot and left in a huff and stomped out, and a couple of days later this famous article appeared in Pravda. And it's a lambasting of the opera, but also a threat at Shostakovich himself. It concludes, this is a game that may end very badly, which was a line designed to scare the hell out of Shostakovich, and it did. And he fell from the heights of international celebrity to becoming an enemy of the people there in Russia. His music was banned for a while. And if people saw him walking down the street, they would cross to the other side not to be seen with him. And this, unbelievably, is the time that Sergei Prokofiev decided it might be a nice time to go back to the USSR. He'd been living outside for 18 years. He was homesick. His style of music making had changed. It had started out, with this kind of dissonant bad boy style. And now he was embracing his melodic abilities, which I think he felt would dovetail well with the precepts of socialist realism. So he moved back, and Stravinsky said to him on the way out, "You are being naive," and he said, "Well, I will rise above it." And he didn't. He was wrong about that, and within a short time he became just another pawn in Stalin's chess game. And in 1938, his passport was revoked, and he went from being a citizen of the world who ranged freely back and forth between the Soviet Union and Western Europe and America to being a virtual prisoner there, and he never left. He was basically unable to leave until he died in 1953. And in 1939, he wrote his first Soviet opera called Semyon Katko, and his chosen director was Meyerhold, who was a holdover from those wild days in the 1920s. He was arrested along with his wife secretly. They were just shot. They were killed doing this process of mounting this opera, which scared everybody quite a lot in the artistic community. And in 1939, he, Shostakovich, others, were writing a lot of sheer propaganda music, on commission. For instance, that happened to be the year that Stalin turned 60, and so he was invited to write cantata in his honor. He called it Zdravista, Cheers to Stalin. And it is this big cantata. And this is also the time when composers like Shostakovich and Prokofiev were finding ways to insert elements of protest and satire into the musical fabric itself. And I think there is such a moment at the end of this cantata where you will hear the chorus singing Stalin's praises in this most obsequious way imaginable. And the music itself is just running obsessively up and down a C major scale, over and over and over again, as if Prokofiev is saying at some level, you want simple-minded, obsequious, socialist, realist music, well, try this on for size. And then in September 1st of that year, the Nazis invaded Poland and the war was on. And this was the time, it's hard to imagine, I think, in our given time, when classical music is so much marginalized from the center of societal concerns, how important it was to building the morale of the people who were living in London and the people who were living in Petrograd at that time, Leningrad at that time. In Paris, maybe not quite so much, because in June of 1940, the Nazis invaded Paris and they marched up and down the Champs-Élysées and they hung the swastika flag from all of the government buildings, including the Paris Opera. And so with Vichy controlling all of the broadcasts, occupied France was not quite as oppositional in its musical life. But in London, just a week after the invasion of the Nazis in Poland, the Blitz started. And this was, again, as it was in World War I, this terrible moment where everything had to close down, and Covent Garden did not function in operatic terms for the 5 years of the war from 40 to 45. But this was not the end of music in London. There was a lot of music being made at the art denuded galleries of the National Gallery of Art.
Kenneth Clark, the director at the time, was walking through the empty, forlorn galleries with all the frames leaning against the walls without their famous masterpieces. And he recounted how he was really depressed on seeing this site, and especially on the thought that he was going to have to give over the building to some anonymous war ministry for the filling of envelopes and the typing of reports. So imagine his joy when he had an unexpected visit in those first days of the war, when Myra Hess, the famous pianist, came to see him with a revolutionary idea. She suggested organising a weekly concert to take place in the gallery. So the concerts began only a few weeks after the war was declared. They were organised in a record number of days, and in fact the first one was performed in October.
And they took place much more than once a week. They took place 5 times a week at lunchtime for the entire duration of the war. She herself played 150. She organized 2,000 of them. They were attended by 800,000 people. And they really were a huge morale booster during this very dark time of the Blitz and the war in London. But I think that the most extraordinary use of a piece of classical music to build the morale of a besieged populace took place in 1942 in Leningrad at the height of the siege. When the Nazis invaded Russia in June of 1941, immediately Shostakovich volunteered for the army, and they said, forget it. His eyes were bad, but they didn't want him to die. So he was there in Leningrad, and he began to write immediately his 7th Symphony, which became known as the Leningrad Symphony. And he let it be known to the populace at large that he was there in the city writing this piece, and it became a symbol of his way of resisting cultural and physical Nazi fascist aggression. And he went on the radio in 1941 as he was writing this, and he actually compared what he was doing culturally to the survival of culture there in Leningrad to the survival physically.
Так пусть же сердца наши будут обращены к священной войне против поработителей, как обращены к ней сердца миллионов людей на всем земном шаре. Пусть лозунг «Все для фронта» станет целью нашего ежедневного труда, всех наших творческих устремлений. Недалеко то время, когда и на нашей улице будет праздник. Будем же достойны участия в этом празднике. Пусть каждый из нас, когда наступит послевоенное время и на земле водворится мир и счастье, сможет с гордостью сказать, что свое творчество военных лет он посвятил борьбе с кровавым фашизмом за светлое будущее человечества.
And as he was at the Leningrad radio house making this speech, bombs were already falling there, and the siege lines had been drawn around Leningrad for this 900-day catastrophic siege during which literally millions of people died, some of them just starved in the streets. And he finished his piece, but he wanted to finish it there in Leningrad, and they just evacuated him. They said, it won't do to have our symbol of cultural resistance to Nazi aggression die. So they sent him down to the Volga River town of Kuibyshev, which is now known as Samara, and he finished it, 80 minutes long, had it put onto microfilm, smuggled out through Tehran. It was played in the West. But its most dramatic performance took place in Leningrad on August the 9th, 1942. It was airlifted back in. A call went out to all musicians to come and rehearse the piece. At first, 15 musicians showed up. The rest were off on the siege lines fighting against the Nazis. So the Soviet commander ordered all musicians to come in from the front and to rehearse this piece. And they did. And the Nazis got wind of the fact that this was going to be a great propaganda coup, and so they tried to disrupt the performance on the day of it. And the Soviet commander ordered a bombing raid on the siege lines, which they called Operation Squall, which is probably the only time that a piece of music was preceded by a bombing raid. And it went off as scheduled, and they put up big loudspeakers over no man's land so that the Nazi soldiers dug into their trenches could hear it and presumably be demoralized by it. And the signature moment of this piece, which is long, is the middle of the development section, the first movement, where he creates a theme that has become known as the invasion theme, which is stunningly banal. It is 22 bars long, and it's comprised somewhat of elements of Deutschland über alles, the descending four-note figure in the third bar. And then it's based on the orchestration and style of Ravel's Bolero. And he melds these elements together into this invasion theme. And over the next 12 minutes, 350 bars, this seemingly innocuous little tune just metastasizes, and it gets bigger and bigger and mutates, and it becomes like a killer strain of bolero. And it finally culminates in this hideous, all-devouring brass band version. As my last offering here in this very long encounter, I'm going to read you a description from the audience point of view of the effect that this had on the people who were there in the siege of Leningrad who heard it performed. This is written by a lady who is named Olga Bergholz, and she became known as the muse of the blockade of Leningrad. She was a poet, a writer. She worked there at the Leningrad radio house at that time when Shostakovich was making his speech. And she wrote, "We could see musicians in army tunics and pea jackets. We could see before us defenders of Leningrad, prepared as ever at any moment to give their lives to their native city, their country, and their people. From the symphony's first bars, we recognized ourselves and the path we had trodden, and the epic of Leningrad, which had already become legendary. The ruthless enemy bearing down on us, our defiant resistance, our grief, our dream of a bright world, our undoubted forthcoming victory. And we who had not cried over the dead bodies of our dear ones in winter were now unable to hold back soundless, bitter, and relieving tears, and we were not ashamed of them. Those of us who worked on the radio heard through that wonderful music the wise voice of its creator, Dmitri Shostakovich, who had said, 'I assure you, comrades, in the name of all Leningraders, that we are invincible and that we are ever at our posts.'" So thank you very much for sticking with me for this long trip across these three musical landscapes. And I hope in some sense it will inform your listening experience in the days ahead. And I look forward to talking with you in the days ahead and seeing you at the concerts as well. And thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Большое спасибо. And до свидания. Thank you.